All right, welcome everyone to another episode of Interspiritual Luminaries with this time Beverly Lanzetta. And we've had a number of these programs the last couple of years with focusing on pioneers and leaders in the field of interspiritual and intercontemplative, a term we're going to talk about today. And this is going to be recorded. And for those of you that are with us or those of you that are not with us, you'll receive both an audio and a video of this recording. And we're so grateful that you're here and that you are interested in these sorts of deeper conversations about what it means to be an interfaith, intermystical, intercontemplative person in the world. And as Beverly's going to talk about today, a monk in the world as well. So I am Jan Lundy, and I'm the co-founder, co-director of the Spiritual Guidance Training Institute, and I am here with my wonderful colleague.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Jeanette Banishak, and with Jan, we co-founded and co-direct the SGTI, as we call it.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm going to turn this over to you, Jeanette, and officially welcome Beverly. Beverly, thank you so much for being with us today. We're so excited to get the word out too about your wonderful new book, A New Silence.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.
All right. So I thought that we'd start with a bio so that people can get to know who you are if they don't yet. I imagine that people on this call or who are listening are in various stages of being acquainted with you. We have Dr. Beverly Lanzetta, who is a theologian, contemplative scholar, and teacher, and the author of many groundbreaking books on emerging global spirituality and new monasticism. And some of her books are A New Silence, Spiritual Practices and Formation for the Monk Within, The Monk Within, Embracing a Sacred Way of Life, Radical Wisdom, A Feminist Mystical Theology, and Foundations in Spiritual Direction. A monk of peace, she's dedicated to a vision of theological openness and spiritual nonviolence. Her work has won praise for its wisdom, eloquence, and mystical insight, and is considered to be a major contribution to what theologian Ursula King called a feminine mystical way for the 21st century. Dr. Lanzetta has taught theology at Villanova University, Prescott College, and Grinnell College, and has started a number of religious and monastic initiatives, including the Desert Interfaith Church, Interfaith Theological Seminary, Hezekiah School of Spiritual Direction, and the Community of a New Monastic Way. She is a much sought after mentor for the new generation, including the spiritual but not religious and new monastics alike, as she brings with her 40 years of experience as a guide to answering the universal call to contemplation. Welcome. We're so excited to have you today.
Thank you.
I wanted to continue or begin and continue this conversation with something from your book, A New Silence, Spiritual Practices and Formation for the Monk Within. This is a prayer that you offered, and if it would be okay, I'd like to read this short prayer in the transition to asking our first question. May I open my soul to your guidance, Holy One, through the heart of a friend in spirit who shares my longing for the inner way of love. And I'll read it one more time. May I open my soul to your guidance, Holy One, through the heart of a friend in spirit who shares my longing for the inner way of love. Amen. Shall we begin? All right. So we have a first question that is more autobiographical, and you wrote your autobiography in the book 9 Jewels, You tell some of your story, and we wonder if you'd share a bit about a significant time in your life for those of us who haven't read your book or listened to any interviews or conversations available online. What's something in your life that was a turning point for you? And did you know it was a turning point at the time? So you use these words in your book: a shattering, life-changing experience of divine love informs all that I say and don't say.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, I would say that in my late 20s, I did have a life-changing religious experience, which set the stage for everything I've done since then. And that was in 1976. And it came on the heels of a number of years of questioning, of deep, I would say deep kind of life engaging questioning. And one of my biggest questions was, is there love? Is there divine love? Is there a love that is not conditional, dependent on the vagaries of everyday life? Is there something that is truly enduring? Can I experience a divine nature? And so on this day, completely unconnected or out of the context, let's say, of what was happening that day, I was brought to an experience first of suffering and then of love. And the experience of suffering was so intense that it literally fell me to the ground. Like I couldn't stand from this experience. And I describe it now. Then I had no words. I hadn't studied theology or anything. But I would describe it now as a mystical experience of the ways in which we harm the divinity in the world. And so it was as if my heart was breaking over how we treat each other, how we treat the earth. And the force of that just came into me like in one like giant transformative experience of suffering, really, of pain. And then after that, and this whole experience took about almost a night and the next day. It was quite long. And after the suffering period ended, I felt this inflow of just love and grace and silence, and also a kind of a wisdom, as if that universal force was trying to show me something about the nature of reality, about what is true. And in that moment, I experienced and knew that underneath all the veils of life, there is this purity, this divinity, this sacred, holy place that lives with us and lives in us and permeates all of creation. And so the experience was both transformative and traumatic in a sense. But from that day forward, I've devoted my life to that vision, and don't feel separated from the suffering and the joy, the experience of how we wound each other, and the experience of our capacity to heal and to transform, and to be in our own souls a site of justice and unification. Us in our own beings, be a person of humility and compassion.
And Beverly, what strikes me too, I'm delighting in, I think I have 3 of your books going on at the same time, following the progression of your journey and how you lived out this vision in the world and how you've done so in such a committed way over the years. I wonder, was it difficult for you to share this mystical journey? one of the things that we hear from people who are mystically oriented or intercontemplative is it's difficult to know how much to share, how much to reveal to the world about the deep transformative experiences we've had. And your book is very courageous, 9 Jewels of Night, I think. And so, was that a difficult process for you to discern how to share that and how to bring it forth in the world?
It was, in a sense, it was. First of all, the experience was so outside of the context of anything I had known or understood that I actually didn't have words. I mean, if someone had asked me what had happened, I wouldn't have known what to say at that moment. So in a sense, yes, it was difficult. But then I discovered when I was at Fordham working on my doctorate, I had not talked to anybody about my experience. No one in my family, very few friends knew about it. And I was walking with one of my cohorts who happened to be a Catholic sister. And I'd written a book called Path of the Heart, which was written before I started my program. And she turned to me and she said, "Why did you write this book?" And I was like, "Oops, what am I going to tell her?" So that semester, my first semester in my doctoral program, we were studying mysticism. And I was like, oh, that's what happened to me. This is what I had, a mystical experience. So I said that to her. I said I had a mystical experience. And she was so open about it and so interested and wanted to talk to me about it. And it really helped open my heart. And at the same time, after teaching in theology, and my field was mysticism, so I taught a lot of courses on that topic, I realized how important it was to talk to students about the mystical life, about this intuitive experiences we have of awe and of transformation, because many of them had had experiences similar to that, and they had never had anyone to talk to about it. So I would say, yes, I would say that the experience itself and my going back to graduate school was creating a language bridge between what I experienced in that moment and what I was able ultimately to communicate. And the process was in many ways painful because it's at times we're digging into the depth of our being to fashion language to actually share what we've experienced without doing an injustice to the experience itself. So, always in a place of sensitivity and humility and, um, lack of self-importance, right? Just simply, this is what happened. And this is how I'm trying to negotiate this. One other thing that happened in that experience that I didn't mention is that part of the experience, in addition to the suffering and the love and all of that, was an injunction. And it was such a strong injunction. It was, do not privilege one religion over another because it wounds my heart. And it was from that part of that experience that I began to work with people from all different religions or non-religious backgrounds and so forth. So yes, that bridge that we're talking about now, interspiritual, intercontemplative, we were not using those words 45 years ago, right? At least I wasn't. I didn't even know those words 45 years ago, right? So yes, language is a bridge that gives us permission to open our hearts to things that we may not have permission to say or even feel.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your story, for your entrustment with us, with your story, with our practice of spiritual direction, of spiritual guidance. We often hear the stories our directees, of our seekers. And I wondered, related to your story about your mystical experience or experiences, in the practice of spiritual direction, when we have a space for our seekers, when a space is created where they can trust us with it, it is a great gift. How do you engage with them when they talk about these moments, these mystical moments, these contemplative moments, or mystical seasons?
Yeah, well, for one thing, I think that I always try to be, and hope I always am very, very supportive and encouraging for them to speak further about it. In other words, I think oftentimes people self-select us, right? And so if most of my spiritual direction practice over the years has been guided towards the contemplative and the mystical. So there's a sense of affirming, not just affirming what someone is saying, but listening for what they're saying. And again, helping them to see how that fits in, perhaps even into a history that gives them permission to further understand it. So, for example, if someone is explaining a sense of anguish or a sense of desire for solitude or a sense of dryness or something like that, then by saying to them, well, I think you're being pulled by the divine into a deeper place, which we would call, and John of the Cross would call the dark night, or someone else would call, fana, annihilation, in Sufism. I mean, this idea of there's a great benefit in people hearing about the historical context, because they don't feel so alone when you can bring in those resources, right? So, like weaving the resources in a very gentle way and affirming the sensitivity of what I like to call the mystic soul. And what I mean by that is of course, we all have a mystical soul in the sense that the depth of us is always has the capacity to be in turn toward the divine. We're always in yearning and aspiration toward the holy. So we all have intrinsic, what I would call a mystical soul, a yearning toward unity, right? But the person who is particularly opened in that way often has a much more permeable sense of the person's relationship to the world. So that person can be very sensitive to the world around them. They can feel alienated from people and situations. They sometimes don't experience or can't name the kind of pain they're feeling. So, as I gave in that my experience back in 1976, it wasn't just my suffering or the world's suffering, it was also God's suffering, right? Divine suffering, because I was shown what you do on earth wounds my being,
Yeah.
right? So oftentimes people in a spiritual guidance session, they're talking about their individual pains, but they're also simultaneously, and not always knowing it, talking about the pain of the earth, the pain of the world, the pain of the divine, because they are mystically open to that. And part of our work or our sharing, soul to soul and heart to heart, is to listen for that and to encourage that, you with whom I'm sharing, you are not going crazy, right? It is possible to feel at this depth. It is possible that our spirits long and mourn and celebrate beyond what we think of as emotion or personality, right? Teresa of Avila would say, the soul experiences at a much deeper and more profound level even than the body.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we honor that that experience. And when someone opens to you that way, then that's a holy moment, you know, where there's a soul to soul, heart to heart sharing of the divine presence in our lives and between us.
Thank you. I'm reminded of a spiritual guide who one time I started crying in a session, and she asked, "What are those tears?" And I thought, well, what are those tears? And there were so many layers to the tears. You know, there were tears for myself in the moment. There were tears for the world, for injustice, for the yearning for love, for the divine love, you know, and so there were all of those layers.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And what a gift of humility that we can share that with each other.
Yeah.
You know, that we can listen and hear that, you know, our deep selves are in solidarity,
Yeah,
with the world, you know, and that we mourn the things that are hurting the world.
yeah.
Beverly, your new book, A New Silence, it really feels by what you're saying that you are inviting us to maybe a different kind of silence, a deeper silence, a multifaceted silence. What is your intention, and where's your heart in terms of inviting us to a new silence? Can you say more about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know, I use a quote in the front of the book from Raymond Panicard that any of you are probably familiar with. And basically what he says, let me just find it quickly. He says, we cannot speak of God without having first achieved an interior silence. So that's an interesting phrase to think about. We cannot speak about God without first achieving an interior silence, because our conversation, our speaking about God is not about a church or a religion or an institution. It's not a concept or a symbol, he says. It is a discourse that every time we speak about God, speak about the mystery, we basically complete it in ineffability, unknowing, right? We can experience it, but we can't completely capture what we've experienced. So every time we enter into, let's just think of an example. We have the experience of awe in the sunset. Well, once we have that experience, we enter again a new beginning, a new silence, a new quickening moment. I like to think of it like that quickening moment right before something comes to fruition, something is born, something is perceived in its depth. And so what I'm trying to say about the title, A New Silence, is that the movement into a monastic life or a new monastic or contemplative life or whatever is always standing on that place between, you know, completion, naming, understanding, knowing, and letting go, emptiness, you know, renewal, transformation, right? And that attitude of standing between those two places, of honoring those two places, is an attitude of openness to others, what I call, you know, a theology of openness. It's an attitude of releasing many millennia of religious exclusivism. And it's a letting go of the injustices, that as we enter a new silence, we can shed those things that have weighed us down, that are perhaps a form of injustice that we have not officially named. It's a place of welcoming everyone into the circle of love, it's a concern for the ravaging of our earth and compassionate solidarity with all its inhabitants. A new silence is that space where we bear the pain of war and identify with the totality of suffering. For me, it's also following the path of Via Feminina, the way of the divine feminine, the compassionate path of nonviolence. And so it's a kind of, it's a revelatory moment. It's like that moment right before, right? That quickening moment. And it's what I'm trying to say here is that we have the capacity if we want to. We don't all want to or choose, and we don't necessarily have to want to or choose, but we all have the capacity to live as monks in the world or contemplatives in the world, because we are co-creating now in this moment a new voice, a new wisdom, new insight, and it's happening in our own beings. So, when we talk about things like, well, we're now interfaith or now we're interspiritual, and we weren't like that, 45 years ago or 100 years ago or something. We're actually, to me, what we're talking about is a faith experience that our souls, our beings have imbibed a sense of another way, a way that is more inclusive, a way that is more loving, less exclusionary, less segregationist, all the things that create pain in the world, that we're trying to listen to that divine voice anew. So we've had what we say, and then we listen for the new, and we place our beings, and we bear the new for the sake of the future. Does that make sense?
It does, absolutely. And so what you have teased out for us too, especially in the new book, are how do we actually live that in the world? What are our orientations, our practices? And so it's a really powerful guide for transforming the way that we are choosing to live, to honor everything that you've just spoken of.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, what I was hoping with the monk within and then a new silence is that I could share a kind of a roadmap or a way that I and a number of other people who have been together for many years have followed a path, and showing that, I have 4 grown children, I have 5 grandchildren. I've raised those children in the midst of this path, and wanted to share with others that we can live a deep, profound religious, spiritual life. We can devote ourselves to God. We can make that the center of our life's meaning, and at the same time include everything in that. And that's kind of the idea of, what has been called like the monastic archetype. Like we all have that in us, or so it seems, a place of silence, a place of solitude. And for those people who yearn for that, how can we live that out? Do we have to go to a monastery, a traditional monastery? Well, no, that we can if we are called there. But how do we live that in the world with others? How do we honor, the call that we have been called to something? We feel it in our being. And I think this is a lot of what I see in spiritual guidance is people who have this deep passion. They know they've been called, but they don't know what to do once they hear the call, because it all seems so insurmountable. How do I establish solitude in the midst of a marriage or with children? Or how do I maintain silence at work? How do I honor my longing for God and not be made fun of and seem naive and all the other things? It's almost like our culture humiliates people for devotion. And, this is part of our work as spiritual guides, is to, and as friends in whatever context we're in, is to celebrate the devotional, to celebrate being an apostle or a pilgrim, and to not be afraid to live a deep spiritual life. And knowing that there is help out there. There are ways, there are techniques, there are practices, and there's other people who have walked the path.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Your work, as I've interacted with your work recently and in this conversation, I wish that I knew about your work 15, 20 years ago. And I know that you were talking in your talks, you've talked about how they've made their way into your books most recently. So you have been doing it for a long time, but I didn't know. I spent a month at a monastery, at a Cistercian monastery. And I think about, like, every moment of that experience was a very special moment. And it took me at least 10 years, and it's taken me more than 10 years to unpack just that 1 month of the rhythm of the life of the sisters. And the way that you have helped me to make sense of some of that experience has been quite profound. So thank you for all that you're bringing in. And you said, you don't need to go to a monastery. I just happened to, because I was intrigued. There was a call. And
the truth is that monasteries are wonderful. And, a monastery, a traditional monastery, we can never replicate exactly what's in a traditional monastery, because in those places you have centuries of people living. I like to think sometimes, like, the stones admit silence, when you're in when you're in a truly functioning monastery, and that has a different efficacy. Yeah. And so they can be very transformative times, and I love monasteries.
Yeah. Well, you use this word new, with new monasticism, a new silence. And the background of this question is that there's a real sweet spot of, like, creativity and contemplation. And that's what my dissertation was about, that inner relationship, that intersection. And so we define in creativity, is it new for a person? Is it new for a culture? Is it new for a society? How would you define new? Who is it new for?
Good question. I think it can be in all ways in this instance, but the new, and I also mentioned that in the book, and is that the new is also resting on centuries of wisdom. So it's not like we're throwing out, right, the wisdom that came before us. It's not like, we don't find value in tremendous connectivity. I mean, like, before, I used to say that my closest friends were the historical mystics, because I didn't really know anybody I could talk to. So, when I was younger, I was reading, mystics in history or saints. So when I say new, I'm not denying the ancestry of wisdom upon which we stand. And at the same time, I like the word new, because it kind of signals to us that there is new revelation being born in this moment. Mm-hmm. There are new types of truths. There are new paths. There are new nuances of the spiritual life. Mm-hmm. And maybe someone in prehistory knew that or said that, but we don't know it. We don't have a record, right? So to us, or to me, it may seem new. For example, and I talk about this a lot, I think in one of the books, is, the history of the soul's journey, historically, at least the way it's written about, is always personal, right? Our sin, our error, our arrogance, our pride, the 7 deadly sins, the 3 poisons. Okay. And all of that is relevant. We all know what that looks like. We all know, like, yeah, I have experienced that phase of interior purification, interior anguish, cleaning, trying to become more pure of heart. But what is also to me very significant and important now is that this interior transformation and acknowledgement of sin or error or whatever we want to call it, this purification is not just personal, it's also social and cultural. It's also racial and sexism, racism, and those sorts of things affect and afflict our souls. So the fact that, perhaps, some great thinker in history experienced that, maybe, experienced that embodied wound, let's say, of being in the world, they didn't write about it much. So we don't, if they knew it and had that language, we don't have that much to go on. So for me, that's I would call that a new dimension of the inner life that we are called to pay attention to. That, how does the soul suffer the violation or the rejection of race, sexuality, gender, so forth and so on. And, Martin Luther King talks about that quite a lot in terms of the harm to the soul of Black people, of African Americans, and what slavery and segregation, all that did to the soul. Okay, so that's an example. I mean, I'm going on a little tangent there, but that's an example for me of new, like, we are co-creating now. We are instruments of justice, of compassion. Our souls bear the disjuncture in our world. And so what can we bring to that, to heal that? What is new that we can bring? And also, of course, we would say, I mean, and I'm sure you know that, we have the dark night of injustice, or the dark night of social injustice. There's also the dark night of religion, where we are forced to realize that our faith traditions contain words of injustice, words of harm. Our faith traditions have been segregationist and exclusive and so forth and so on. So there's all of those dimensions. And to me, this is, yes, the divine is speaking to us again in a new way. Not that justice hasn't been part from the beginning, right? I mean, it's not like I invented justice. Not trying to imply that.
Beverly, I wonder if this is a good time to jump into another new way, which is not really new, but you've put a new language to it for us, and a new understanding of the path, and that is the Via Feminina.
Mm-hmm.
Love to have you talk about that.
Okay.
And maybe just define it, because people are going, Via Feminina, we've heard of the Via Positiva, the Via Negativa. What is the Via Feminina?
Right. Well, actually, that phrase actually came to me when I was teaching a class on the 2 contemplative paths, Via Positiva and Via Negativa, which, as many of you know, is a way of approaching the divine, in the sense that Via Positiva is we ascribe names to the ultimate. God is good, God is beautiful, God is holy. And the Via Negativa is we basically take away all names, because we come to a place of silence and ineffability. God is greater than any thought. God is a super essential ray of divine darkness. Or ultimate reality is mu, nothingness, shunyata. Okay, so that's positive and negative. And while I was teaching the class, I just found myself saying, oh, there's a third way, the Via Feminina. And I kind of almost shocked myself, actually. I was like, what are you saying? And then I realized that I really was saying a path that had been instilled in me from that experience in 1976, which was a distinctive path to mystical union, a path that follows by way of intimacy, a divine of intimacy, follows by way of compassion, mercy, loving kindness. It's not based on the separation. It almost starts out at a mystical place of unification. And from that place of unification, seeks to become more and more compassionate, more and more fully oneself. And it's also, in that sense, it's also via Feminina in the sense that it is about women's experience and about the feminine in men. And in both cases, I would say it's about reclaiming the divinity of womanhood, women made in the Imago Dei, the divine image, fully human, full humanity, full claiming of women's divine journey, divine right, and also the full divinity of the feminine in men and in the world. Okay, a number of feminist theologians have talked about how the desecration of the earth, the ecological desecration, is a reflection of our desecration of the feminine. So Via Feminina is a process of transformation that is initiated by the divine. It's a passive movement in which we are led to let go of the injustice to ourselves as women and to the feminine in each other and in the world. And I think it's a very important path at this time in history. You know, as I said, with the idea of a new silence, maybe I didn't mention it in the beginning, but our new silence will turn over into another new silence in some other generation, right? So I can't proclaim that Via Feminina is a path for all time. I don't know that. I just know that it's a very profound path, at least it has been for me, in the sense that it's calling us to a deeper place of intimacy, relationality, nonviolence, compassion. And it sinks down through all these different levels. Okay, so it's personal and relational, like I said earlier. You know, it's our own self-doubts, our own sins, our own betrayals, the ways in which the feminine has been harmed in us personally. It's also generational. It comes down through our families, female ancestors, males within whom the feminine, the merciful, has been harmed. It also is social and cultural. It affects gender, race, sexual orientation. It has an implication on all these different levels. It's religious. How is the feminine portrayed in religious texts, in scripture? How have religious authorities diminished or denied the spiritual authority of women or the feminine voice? You know, how have women's full humanity and divinity been betrayed? And how has the feminine divine been betrayed in the world? It's also theological, you know, patriarchy. It has seeped into our consciousness at such a level that it's a mystical reclamation of the fullness of our unified whole, right? And it's also ontological because it's healing all that stands in the way of being created in the divine image. I mean, either our theologies, our religions are true, that Atman is Brahman, we are Imago Dei, you know. Samsara, I mean, sorry, uh, what's the word now? I forgot all of a sudden, but samsara is nirvana, correct? This world is enlightened, is heaven, is transformative. Either that's true or not. And if it's true, then how do we make it a reality? How do we heal those deep places in us that have been harmed and succumbed to the denigration of the fullness of our being? And I think this is very critical today. So it's a mystical state of transformation. And I like to think of it as an interior action of justice. So that whether you are a social activist in the world, you really are, in a sense, as we heal these things, we really are social mystics in our own souls. The degree to which we heal in our own being these discrepancies and injustices is a form of mystical justice, let's say, right? So when we think we're doing nothing, when someone comes to us in spiritual guidance and feels like they just have done, I don't know what I'm doing. I just cry all the time. I feel this anguish. I'm so sensitive, and it could feel so lonely and unconnected to anything. And yet the way I see it is that person's soul is doing divine work. It's seeking to create justice. It's seeking to create compassion, love. And of course, we have to be discerning. Not every time we're crying and so forth. I can give you, caveats about that. But I think you understand what I'm saying in the deepest place, right? That we want to recognize the power, the gift we've been given to be forces of unification in our own souls. And that is an incredible gift, I think.
Sarah, who's one of our attendees here, has a question. I think it relates to this really well, Beverly. She says, as an emerging interspiritual guide and as a middle-aged white woman, how can I widen my circle and connect with and serve BIPOC and people of color? And so what you just said seems to be an invitation to attend to your own inner being first. Out of that deep awareness and practice arises a greater sense of how to serve others, how to be with others, especially those who are marginalized, who are struggling. We're talking about a mystical justice, an interior action of justice. Mm-hmm. And that would be the first place to start.
Well, I think, none of these things are linear. They're very organic and circular. And sometimes we discover something in the world and, daily life that turns us inward. Sometimes it's inward pushing outward. So I'm not trying to set it up as a, linear progression. But what I was really pointing toward is when a person is in your presence and feels in their being that you honor and stand with them, are present with them in their inner life, that leads to a change and an opening, because we do perceive each other. So how do we reach out to other people? We reach out in part by turning our hearts into becoming more and more compassionate, more and more aware of what other people are suffering. What does, we have this whole issue lately of what Black Lives Matter and the terrible tragedy that happens to so many people, deaths and things like that. where does our heart stand in that, right? Where is our compassion? And then I think by recognizing that in the depth we all share this pain, we are able to welcome people into the circle, and other people feel welcomed into the circle, right? So what a person would do practically, that's individual. I wouldn't know. I'm talking more about in the spiritual direction relationship. We certainly can all do many things, like donate our time, participate in helping out with issues of inequity and injustice and financial difficulties and all these different things. But in the relationship of spiritual guidance, it's, not claiming, but speaking that you are open to this world and that you want to be a companion in this place. And I think that that someone sitting in your presence will feel that truth. Do you know what I mean? They will know whether you really are there.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
And, reading and studying, there's many more books coming out, like on spiritual direction in different cultures, different gender-based, race-based, spiritual direction. How are people in these different communities dealing with their particular issues?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I think that answers it really well. Yeah. We've got about 5 more minutes. Jeanette, do you have a final thought or final question you want to pose to Beverly? Or Beverly, is there something that you would like to say to us that we haven't talked about, that feels important for you to share at this time?
I think, I'm happy to take any other question if it's out there, so I don't want to interfere with that. But I would say that I think we're in a very profound time in the world. And of course, of the many things that are happening, we have a pandemic, we have social unrest, we have political unrest, we have injustices of all kinds. And I think that, for me anyway, the most important thing that I've been able to do in this period is to sink into the center of my being and be willing to bear the disjuncture between these different places in reality. And what I mean by bear is not just to intellectually know or emotionally express and all these other levels. It's to actually put my body and spirit kind of on, how do I want to say it? Put my body and spirit in a place of being available in my depth to shoulder some of that disjuncture. And so it feels like as a society, we're in a big impasse between a reality that we can't go back to and one that we don't see the full dimensions of yet. And I think that if we can recognize that this is a period when the divine is calling us, we're being called to something, and the degree to which we're willing to bear that something, right, to take it in, to let ourselves experience what that is. I think that to that degree, we will be helping, transform and heal our future. With all the things that have gone on in my life in the last couple of years, the pandemic, heart surgery, and a bunch of other things, I would not have been able to go through that without the many years of contemplation and the great gift that we've been given as humans to participate in the inner life of reality. What a gift. And so I think that if we can bear that now in these moments of impasse, in this moment of discord, Thomas Merton said, and I'm paraphrasing now, but one of my favorite phrases from him is, he said, if I can unite within myself, Catholicism and Protestantism, Buddhism and Hinduism, Islam and Judaism, if I can unite within myself all these differences, I can help to unite the whole world. And he was talking about in himself, to let go of any kind of exclusion or separation or superiority or, priority of salvation, to simply unite in himself as the divine unites in us. We can help heal each other. And it's not easy, it doesn't happen all at once. But that's what I think of now, is the great gift of uniting in contemplation.
Thank you. Thank you. What a wonderful way to bring our thoughts together as we end our official time together. You have so many wonderful resources for us too, Beverly, on your website. So I'd like to remind people to go to your website. It really is a cornucopia of beautiful resources and guidance. So that is beverlylanzetta.net. And we will make sure that everyone has a link to that also.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a really lovely to be with both of you, and all of you that I cannot see but know are there.
Well, thank you so very much.
Thank
Yes.
you. Blessings.
Beverly, thanks so much as well. I really appreciate the voice that you have in the world, and I hope that it continues to gain some momentum.
Thank you.
It's much
Thank
needed,
you, everyone,
and appreciated.
Yeah.
Indeed. May it be so. Many blessings to you.
Bye.